And today we have with us Professor Robert Talisse from Vanderbilt University. You have a named position there? Is it the
people call me names there.
Rob is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt. And Rob's primary area of research is contemporary political philosophy, and he's concerned with issues regarding democracy, deliberation, pluralism, liberalism, civic republicanism, and marriage and constitutional amendments regarding marriage. But today Rob's talk is going to be called Dilemmas of Public Reason, and Rob has just finished a book called Democracy After Liberalism, which is coming out from Routledge sometime in 2005.
Early, they say.
Early, they say.
But we've heard that one.
Rob's next major project is a book called Virtue and the Politics of Deliberation. And in that book, he's going to weave together virtue ethics, the virtue epistemology, and deliberative democracy, and put it all into a Deweyan framework, I trust. No Dewey.
Right.
Sorry, I'm pushing my own biases. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Rob, and please.
Thank you.
Feel free to begin.
Well, thanks for coming, and thanks, Dave, for inviting me, Mark for picking me up at the airport. It's been a great visit so far. This paper was written, I published a paper a year ago called Rawls on Pluralism and Stability, which I thought was a fairly devastating objection to the later Rawls and later Rawlsian styles of liberal theory. And apparently some other people who I've never met agreed and started sending me emails about how they liked the paper, and it was totally devastating, and then said, so, can you write another paper launching a devastating objection against Rawls? There's safety in numbers. So I started working on this, and I'm giving it in a couple of places, and so this is one of the earlier drafts, so any suggestions would be appreciated. And I understand that some of you are together reading the later Rawls's political liberalism book, so there's going to be a lot about that in here. If you don't know anything about the later Rawls or the earlier Rawls or any Rawls in between, or don't care or have had enough of Rawls for one lifetime, I think you could pretty much substitute your favorite liberal theorist for Rawls in this. I think the argument will go through nonetheless. So let me start. A little over a decade ago, John Rawls launched a searing criticism of liberal political theory. The force of the criticism is captured by Rawls's claim that, and I quote, "The question the dominant tradition has tried to answer has no answer." By this, Rawls meant that the traditional aspiration of liberal theory, you think of Locke or Kant, to provide a firm philosophical foundation for liberal politics was profoundly misguided. According to Rawls, this aspiration, common to Locke, Kant, Mill, Dworkin, others, is misguided due to the fact of reasonable pluralism. Reasonable pluralism is the claim that moral epistemology is such that conflicts between fundamental philosophical, moral, and religious views, what Rawls calls comprehensive doctrines, are intractable even among fully rational and sincere and well-intentioned persons. Since liberalism is committed to a conception of legitimacy, according to which the political order must be justifiable to every last individual, and since the fact of reasonable pluralism means that there is no comprehensive doctrine that can win the consent, or the assent, I should say, of all reasonable citizens, a radical conclusion follows, namely, the project of trying to propose a philosophical justification for liberal politics is inherently self-defeating. Accordingly, in his book Political Liberalism and Related Work, Rawls proposed to apply what he calls the principle of toleration to philosophy itself. This is done by jettisoning the philosophical aspiration of liberal theory. Rather than proposing philosophical premises from which liberal commitments are supposed to follow, the political liberal begins by, quote, looking to the public culture of a modern liberal society and attempts to, quote, identify a shared fund of implicitly recognized basic ideas and principles. In this way, the later Rawls proposes a liberalism that is, as he says, freestanding. The objective of a freestanding liberal theory, then, is not to provide a proof or demonstration of the justice of liberal politics, but rather to formulate the characteristically liberal ideas and principles clearly enough to be combined into a political conception of justice that's congenial to our most firmly held convictions. And the firmly held convictions are things like slavery is wrong, discrimination based on gender is wrong, so on and so forth. That is, you don't try to prove those. The theory of liberalism begins from those. According to Rawls, the task of collecting and systematizing the principles implicit in liberal society is, as he says, quote, the most we can expect from liberal philosophy, and then he adds, nor do we need more. Rawls's political liberalism has been criticized from all sides. Liberal theorists like Gene Hampton and Ronald Dworkin and Sam Scheffler have argued that a freestanding liberalism is an impoverished liberalism, a liberalism that in the end cannot give anyone a reason to be a liberal. Other theorists, both liberal and otherwise, have argued that it is strictly impossible for liberal theory to, quote, stay on the surface, philosophically speaking, because there are substantive and contestable philosophical claims latent within the considered convictions from which Rawls aims to begin. These debates are still very much alive in the literature, and it's difficult to discern whether there will be any clear victor. Hence my argument in the current essay deviates slightly from the typical critical strategies. Here I aim to launch an internal objection to Rawls's political liberalism. The argument will focus on Rawls's conception of public reason, and will show that political liberalism must fail according to its own criteria of success. More specifically, the argument will show that whereas Rawls invokes public reason as a mechanism for maintaining political stability, recent work by the legal and political theorist Cass Sunstein shows that there are sound empirical reasons for thinking that the strictures of public reason will in fact generate increasing levels of instability. Although the argument targets Rawls's position in particular, the general line of objection can be brought against a variety of views of public discourse that are in currency. The Rawlsian models of proper public discussion proposed by Tom Nagel, Bruce Ackerman, Stephen Holmes, and Charles Larmore are vulnerable to the criticisms I shall raise. Additionally, influential versions of deliberative democracy, such as those offered by Josh Cohen and Amy Cutman and Dennis Thompson, are subject to my criticism also. It might also be the case that the discursivisms of Jürgen Habermas and Karl Otto Appel are similarly jeopardized. I, of course, can't argue for all of these claims in a single paper, although if there's something particular, if there's a Habermasian in the room who wants to push me on that, I think we can during question and answer. But I can't take care of it in the paper. The point is that a successful critique of Rawls on these points is going to implicate lots of other theorists. So let me give you some background about the sort of important aspects of the political liberalism view that will play into the argument. The main question driving Rawls's book, Political Liberalism, is that of how it could be possible for citizens to achieve consensus on a single conception of political justice under conditions of reasonable pluralism. That is, if everybody is divided over questions of religion and philosophical and moral essentials, how can they all agree on one conception of justice that's going to govern them politically? One obvious answer, and familiar to people who know something about Hobbes or contemporary Hobbesians, like Russell Hardin or somebody like that, one obvious answer to the problem is what Rawls calls a modus vivendi agreement, where liberalism, that is a conception of justice that's liberal, is adopted as a modus vivendi. Each citizen sees the political order as an acceptable compromise between the unattainable best state of affairs, which would be a politics based entirely on his own comprehensive doctrine, and the avoidable worst state of affairs, namely a political order that completely reflects the doctrine that opposes his own. So this would be a kind of Hobbesian truce. Although the suggestion that justice prevails where no one gets what he wants most, but everyone avoids what he most fears, enjoys a distinguished lineage stretching through Hobbes all the way back to Plato's Glaucon, if you remember the first book of the Republic, the second book rather, it's rejected by Rawls. According to Rawls, a modus vivendi agreement can last only for as long as there is a relative balance of power among the conflicting doctrines. Since a modus vivendi liberalism is really nothing more than a Hobbesian truce, it can provide no motivation for an individual to uphold the agreement should the balance of power turn decisively in his favor. This is, by the way, why Hobbes thought you needed the Leviathan, right? Something that would keep all the power relations in check. But of course, this is the respect in which Hobbes is not a liberal. Okay. A modus vivendi liberalism, Rawls says, is political in the wrong way. It's political in the bad sense of the word political, and hence inherently unstable. By contrast, Rawls envisioned a liberalism that could win what he calls an overlapping consensus among citizens, where a liberal order is endorsed in an overlapping consensus rather than as a modus vivendi or truce agreement. Each individual sees the liberal conception as the appropriate expression of his own comprehensive doctrine in the political sphere. Thus, although citizens do not share a common justificatory account of liberalism, each supports the political order for its own sake and on its own merits. Consequently, individuals will continue to endorse the liberal order regardless of the balance of power among the contending doctrines. In this way, political stability, Rawls thinks, is possible under conditions of pluralism. Since only a freestanding liberalism, that is a liberalism which in its formulation doesn't presuppose any particular one of the contemporary contending doctrines, since only that kind of liberalism can win an overlapping consensus, only a freestanding liberalism can be stable. The implication, of course, being that the entire tradition of liberal philosophy, from Locke all the way onwards through Dworkin, Susan Oken, I mean anybody you want to name, is inherently unstable, because all of those views presume that there's but one account of justice that all rational persons should be expected to endorse. Of course, politics is not exhausted once an overlapping consensus is achieved. Laws must be made, campaigns waged, elections held, votes cast, legal cases decided. In these endeavors as well, citizens confront the obstacles to the agreement posed by the obstacles to the agreement posed by the fact of reasonable pluralism. Hence, Rawls proposed a mode of public political discourse in which citizens, quote, conduct their fundamental discussions within a framework of what each regards as a political conception of justice based on values that the others can reasonably be expected to endorse. In public political discussion, then, citizens, quote, should be ready to explain the basis of their actions to one another in terms that each could reasonably expect that the others might endorse as consistent with their freedom and equality. This means that, as in political justification generally, citizens, quote, are not to appeal to their comprehensive religious and philosophical doctrines in properly public discussion. It should be pointed out that Rawls thinks this stricture also holds for voting. That is, when you're deciding who to vote for, and let's say you have some religious commitments that lead you to have a certain view on abortion, for example. And if you want, say, so you have your religious convictions lead you to hold the pro-life view. If you vote for the pro-life candidate, because that person best serves your comprehensive view about religion, you're failing at democratic citizenship on Rawls's view, right? You're doing something, you're voting improperly, or something like this. Why? Because the reason for your votes, you're voting on the basis of reasons that not everybody could accept as a good reason for you to vote. Of course, certain questions, this is a good segue, certain questions cannot be understood except in terms of deep philosophical commitment. Abortion might be one of them. These will be questions about which we should expect citizens to disagree sharply. In light of this, Rawls contends that, quote, a liberal view removes from the political agenda the most divisive issues, serious contention about which must undermine the bases of social cooperation. Democratic deliberation hence applies not to public policy questions generally, but only to what Rawls calls constitutional essentials and questions of basic justice. Hence, Rawls identifies the Supreme Court as the exemplar of public reason. Do you imagine that? That's how our political discussions should be conducted? Just go and read some of those, read Scalia on some of these things. Okay. Citizens holding comprehensive doctrines that compel them to seek a politics based in what they see as the whole truth, who consequently insist upon appealing to non-public reasons in public discourse, fail to recognize the duty of civility, and that's a technical term, the duty of civility, which is the duty to recognize everybody's equality by not demanding that everybody accept your religious, philosophical, or moral premises when you're trying to explain to them what your why you act in the way that you do politically. So if you seek a politics based on the whole truth and consequently insist upon appealing to reasons drawn from your own moral, philosophical, or religious doctrines in public discourse, you're uncivil, and so you fall short of the ideal of democratic citizenship. Remember the abortion example I just raised. More importantly, citizens who reject the idea of public reason, that is, who reject the idea that public discussion should be conducted in these sort of moral, philosophical, and religiously neutral terms, people who reject the idea of public reason in this way are ipso facto unreasonable. And unreasonable and reasonable and reasonableness, these are all important terms for Rawls. Consequently, Rawls thinks they may be dealt with coercively. Rawls writes, a given society may contain unreasonable, irrational, and even mad comprehensive doctrines. In their case, the problem, and I love this language, the problem is to contain them so that they do not undermine the unity and justice of society. And let me just quote, he makes a similar point later in the book, but the language is a little bit more interesting. He says in a footnote, that there are doctrines that reject one or more democratic freedoms is itself a permanent fact of life, or at least it seems so. This gives us the practical task of containing them, like war or disease, so that they do not overturn political justice. As this brief survey shows, public reason places restrictions, and this is a point I'm borrowing from Sheila Ben-Habib, on the agenda and the vocabulary of democratic deliberation. Political liberalism is in this way an instantiation of what Stephen Holmes has called the politics of omission. You don't really get to say really what you think, and you don't really get to raise the reasons why you think those things. You have to figure out political, that is, neutral reasons for explaining what your views are. For the present purpose, though, it's important to observe, in addition, that public reason aims at an agreement that is what I'll call non-epistemic. To explain, when operating within public reason, citizens do not aim for outcomes based on the epistemically best reasons or arguments or evidence, but rather for the outcome that best concurs with the sort of basic judgments and intuitive liberal principles that are already assumed, like slavery is bad, gender discrimination is unjust, and so on and so forth. That is, public reason takes the basic commitments of a liberal society as what Rawls calls fixed points, and requires, as a condition of reasonableness, that citizens' contributions to public discourse recognize them. In other words, on the Rawlsian view, the reasonableness of a doctrine or belief or viewpoint is primarily a matter of its content rather than its justification. And the reasonableness of a person is a matter of which views he holds rather than the extent to which he supports his views by evidence or reasons. In this sense, public reason is what I'll call an epistemically closed system. No anti-liberal position, or even mild, I mean, we don't have to think of anti-liberal positions as, fascist positions, even mildly anti-liberal positions, that is, positions which are anti-liberal but still democratic, right? And I believe that there are several, and they're pretty good. No anti-liberal position, no matter how tightly argued or well supported, could be reasonable in a Rawlsian liberal order. In fact, there could be no properly public discussion about the merits of liberalism itself, and no public discussion about the appropriateness of public reason as a model of liberal political discourse. That is, the very idea of reasonableness presumes that you're already accepting the sort of fundamentals of liberal political theory. So therefore, any attempt to call those fundamental assumptions into question is already to be unreasonable. That is to say, right now, as I am talking here before you, I am being an unreasonable person. There's a common line of criticism that attacks public reason, or Rawlsian public reason, for being inherently exclusionary. In an ironic instance of overlapping consensus, the exclusion objection, as I shall call it, is found in the work of theorists who otherwise agree on nothing. For example, radical Democrats and feminists like Sheila Ben-Habib, Nancy Fraser, and Irish Young argue that since public reason proceeds from a strict delineation of a properly political vocabulary, it implicitly privileges the status quo. Public reason, therefore, comes to nothing more than an apologia for existing power structures, which crowd out and silence the voices and concerns of the less powerful. There's a well-known and widely cited article by a woman named Lynn Sanders in political theory that is the common source of this kind of objection. It's worth looking at. It's called Pathologies of Deliberation or something like this. Or no, it's actually against deliberation. But it's a I'm sure you can sort of anticipate how this line of objection runs, and I think it's a fairly strong line of objection. So we've got feminists and radical Democrats on one hand saying that it's exclusionary, privileges the status quo. Note also that natural law theorists, and I'm thinking here of Robert George and Christopher Wolfe, agree with the feminists and radical Democrats. Imagine that. They claim, I'm quoting now an article by George and Wolfe, public reason almost always has the effect of making the liberal position the winner in morally charged political controversies. It does this, in effect, by ruling out of bounds substantive moral argument on behalf of all non-liberal positions. But as if feminist, radical Democrats, and natural law theorists weren't enough, the civic Republican / communitarian Michael Sandel agrees. He laments the political costs of public reason, arguing that public reason is too spare to contain the moral energies of a vital democratic life. And the worry is not restricted to these anti-liberal theorists, right? The radical Democrat, feminist, natural law, and communitarian. Some liberals, too, criticize public reason on this ground. William Galston at the University of Maryland expresses the liberal concern with public reason as follows. And this is interesting because it does echo the stability kind of concerns that are driving Rawls. Galston says, it's difficult to imagine that any liberal democracy can sustain conscientious support, that is stability, if it tells millions of its citizens that they cannot rightly say what they really believe as part of democratic public discourse. The exclusion objection has been met with both a clarification and a qualification. As for the clarification, Charles Larmore, who is a political liberal, he's a later Rawlsian, explains, quoting Larmore, rightly conceived, public reason does not thwart the uninhibited political discussions which are the mark of a vigorous democracy. We can argue with one another about political issues in the name of our different visions of the human good, while also recognizing that, when the moment comes for a legally binding decision, we must take our bearings from a common point of view. That's Larmore. No, take our bearings from a common point of view. This is right to presume that there is one. The restrictions, or that the point of view that he's holding as the common one is in fact common. The restrictions of public, just to explain, the restrictions of public reason apply only to decision-making contexts, Larmore tells us, not to political discussion generally. Hence the requirement that the most divisive issues be removed from the public political agenda does not quell discussion among citizens in non-public domains. In fact, like Larmore, Rawls affirms that lively debate about controversial issues like abortion, conducted by means of non-public reason, is what he says, a vital activity within, quote, the background culture of a liberal democracy. That's the clarification. Now for the qualification. In work following the publication of Political Liberalism, Rawls introduced what he calls the proviso as a revision of public reason's vocabulary restrictions. According to the proviso, citizens in properly public discussions may invoke reasons drawn from their comprehensive doctrines, provided they are prepared, as Rawls says, in due course, to offer public reasons to supplement the non-public ones. He's driven to this by the kind of criticism that runs, wait a minute, Rawls, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail violates public reason on your view. That's not proper political discourse. That seems crazy. This should be an exemplar of public discourse, right? I mean, just if you go back to the letter, think of all the theological sort of conceptions that are appealed to there. So he's saying, well, no, I can accept the letter from Birmingham jail as long as King is in due course willing to give reasons that don't rest with conceptions drawn from St. Augustine or wherever. I think this rejoinder is unsatisfying, the proviso, right? Although the exclusion objection is often formulated as to suggest that it is aimed at public reason's agenda and vocabulary restrictions, it should be understood instead, I think, to be aimed at the non-epistemic character of public reason. What public reason excludes is not the radical democratic, feminist, Thomist, and civic republican positions, but rather the reasons associated with those doctrines. More precisely, public reason cannot recognize a Thomist's reasons as reasons. Accordingly, even an irrefutable proof of the Thomistic doctrine of ensoulment is insufficient to render reasonable a Catholic's public opposition to abortion. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? You can prove, right? I mean, just imagine the kind of world that we wish we all lived in, where there were such things as knockdown philosophical proofs that were just once and for all we've proven this. And just imagine again that the Thomist view about ensoulment happens to be right. You're unreasonable to assert it publicly on this view. Presumably, this is due to the fact of reasonable pluralism, which would have it that a logically sound, right? I mean logically sound in the formal sense, right? That a sound demonstration of X is insufficient for a proof of the falsity of all views inconsistent with X. But why should our Thomist, or anyone else for that matter, endorse such a pluralism? Here, the political liberal has to be careful. He cannot offer a philosophical argument for his pluralism. To do so would be to violate the very idea of a freestanding liberalism. That is, if you get the political liberalism by means of a philosophical argument for pluralism, you're no longer doing philosophy-free political thinking, right? That is, you're giving a liberal theory that looks a lot like Locke's theory, or Mill's theory, or Kant's theory. It's just the philosophical stuff at the beginning is different. Okay? But the justificatory structure is the same. The question why one should accept reasonable pluralism is a question to which political liberalism, quote, Rawls admits this, does not speak. We don't answer that question. By the way, this is the respect in which I think that the later Rawls really starts looking indistinguishable from Rorty. This is the priority of democracy to philosophy, with a vengeance. I mean, Rorty is a little bit more honest about it, I think. This will strike. So, if the Thomist says, well, here's my proof, it's irrefutable for ensoulment, Rawls says, yeah, but that's to violate pluralism, of course. The fact that your view of ensoulment P is true doesn't mean that all views inconsistent with P are false. And Thomas says, why in the world am I supposed to believe that? Rawls says, well, that's not a question to which I speak. This will strike the Thomist as dishonest and hypocritical. However, to object to the political liberal's silence on this issue is to be unreasonable on Rawls's view. And thus someone the liberal state must endeavor to contain, like war and disease. In this way, public reason is epistemically exclusionary, regardless of how widely it is construed, regardless of what the proviso says, regardless of what you might want to say to Dr. King about how, well, tomorrow give us the real reasons. Regardless of how widely it's construed, public reason cannot acknowledge the epistemic force of arguments advanced in favor of non-liberal, even weakly non-liberal, that is, non-liberal democratic positions, and cannot give reasons why the force of those arguments should be disregarded. That's the other kicker. So we don't listen to your arguments, and then you say, well, why don't you listen to my arguments? We don't speak to that question. Rawls's proviso confirms this. That persons who advance non-public reasons in political contexts are bound by the proviso to supply public reasons, quote, in due course, indicates that the non-public arguments do no justificatory work, no matter how epistemically sound they may be. Although public reason may allow everyone a voice, given the proviso, it grants a hearing to only a few. I steal that slogan from Bob Gooden, who is employing it in a different context. The political liberal will concede this point, but question its critical force. He may argue as follows, and this is the political liberal. The citizens who insist on presenting arguments that presume the truth of their own comprehensive doctrines are failing at proper democratic citizenship because they implicitly reject the fact of reasonable pluralism, recognition of which is necessary for the stability of a liberal regime. Thus, the insistent Thomist, civic Republican, and radical Democrat are all destabilizing forces, and surely a liberal democracy, like any other regime, should be expected to endeavor to secure its own stability. So I'm continuing with the political liberal rejoinder, so whereas it may be the case that public reason cannot duly recognize the epistemic merits of all views, there's no reason why one should require it to do so. I think that's a cogent reply, but it confronts another difficulty. Namely, there's good reason to expect that the non-epistemic character of public reason will generate political instability. The argument for this claim draws from some recent work in what I'll call group epistemology, to which I'll now turn. Cass Sunstein has called attention recently to the statistical regularity known as group polarization. Group polarization means that, quoting Sunstein, members of a deliberating group predictably move toward a more extreme point in the direction indicated by the members' pre-deliberation tendencies. The term extreme here does not refer to points on the spectrum of political opinion. It's rather defined internally, that is, only by reference to persons' doxastic tendencies prior to the discussion. So to put it simply, group polarization means like-minded people, after discussions with their peers, tend to end up thinking a more extreme version of what they thought before they started to talk. Let's cite some of Sunstein's own examples. And in Sunstein's most recent book, which is called Why Societies Need Dissent, which I recommend to you highly, he gives all the citations for all the studies, so you can go follow it up. But here are just some of the examples Sunstein likes to play with. One, a group of moderately pro-feminist women will become more strongly pro-feminist after discussion. Right? Two, after discussion, citizens of France became more critical of the United States and its intentions with regard to economic aid. Three, after discussion, whites predisposed to show racial prejudice offer more negative responses to the question of whether white racism is responsible for conditions faced by African Americans in American cities. Four, after discussion, whites predisposed to not show racial prejudice offer more positive responses to the same question. So the idea here isn't that the person with the more extreme view convinces the others to come along. It's consistent in that no matter where, everybody, we all agree on, on position P with regard to some, we're all pro-life, let's just say, or we're all pro-choice, it doesn't matter. And let's say there's a spectrum of pro-choice opinion. And we get together to discuss our, the importance of reproductive rights and such. After such discussions, each one of us holds a more extreme version, will hold a more extreme version of the pro-life position, or pro-choice position. So everybody shifts to something more extreme. So group polarization has been found all over the world and in many diverse tasks. It does not discriminate along any of the usual indicators, education, class, ethnicity, gender, or political lines. It's been shown to be operative in judicial panels, legislatures, political parties, religious organizations, civic groups, and so on. Moreover, the polarization effect is greatly amplified in cases of what we will call enclave deliberation, which is that form of deliberation that occurs within a more or less insulated group in which like-minded people speak mostly to each other over extended periods of time. So there'll be a polarization effect almost in any encounter in which everybody's in rough agreement on the issue. But if for example, a pro-choice group keeps meeting, we keep polarizing, and each time we meet, we polarize more radically than we did the previous time. Okay. So to put this in sort of philosophical terms, talking with people who agree with you roughly on terms doesn't only increase what we would call the degree of your belief, your confidence that you're right. It actually, what we actually see is that there's a shift in the content of what you believe. As I was saying to Morgan, this is a nice empirical demonstration that John Stuart Mill got this part right in chapter 2 of Anonymity, which chapter 2, yeah, which I'm kind of happy about. I always like Mill. Group polarization shows that deliberative bodies of like-minded persons are what I'll call epistemically unstable. The concern here is not the instability as such. Changing beliefs is not necessarily bad, especially if you move from a false belief to a true one, right? But rather, the danger is that the shifts in belief occur only in one direction. They only become more extreme. There's no polarization to more moderate views. And without regard for reasons. That is, when a group polarizes, the members come to adopt increasingly more extreme versions of their former positions. And this movement is not occasioned by the introduction of better arguments. When groups polarize, it's because of social dynamic factors, not because of reasons. According to Sunstein, the antidote to polarization is a vibrant culture of free speech that prizes and even, he thinks, should reward dissent. Such a culture employs blocks to epistemic insularity and takes positive steps to ensure that citizens are exposed to appropriately rich, this is his term, argument pools. Sunstein offers several interesting policy recommendations designed to counteract polarization. We can't discuss them here. Just one thing, he has a nice book, 2001, on the internet called Republic.com, in which he argues that the government ought to institute what he calls must-carry links, or must-carry laws. That is, politically partisan websites, he thinks, that should be forced to carry links to political sites that have opposing views. One of the interesting facts about after the book came out and I read it, I went to the site that he set up for his book and found that there were no links to any critical reviews of his book. Apparently I was not the only one to have emailed him about this, because I got an email from him saying, I've gotten hundreds of emails about this. I promise I am putting it, I'm going to take care of it. Another sort of outcome of the group polarization stuff is that it seems that the best way to get people to obey a law isn't the normal way, which is, increase penalties or beat the police force. The best way to get compliance is just to put signals in the culture that suggest that everybody obeys. If you think that nobody cheats on their taxes, you're not going to cheat on your taxes. If you think nobody runs through the toll without paying, you're very unlikely to do it. So, it's a more efficient and effective way to get compliance is just to work on our sort of predisposition to conformity. Okay. That public reason is likely to generate deliberative enclaves should be plain. Citizens are very deeply committed to their comprehensive doctrines, and some of them conflict with political liberalism on several levels. Citizens of faith present a conspicuous but not the only example. The literature is always talking about religious belief, but there are all kinds of other, but I'll just keep with the standard kind of example. I should think of a different one because it's like beating a dead horse. But many religious believers hold not only that abortion is a grave moral evil, but also that their opposition to abortion must not be regulated to the background culture of society. As Nicholas Wolterstorff has argued, for many liberal democratic citizens, their religion is not about something other than their social political existence. Their religion is also about their social and political existence. Interestingly, this situation is not altogether different for the radical Democrat, who disagrees with the political liberal not only on substantive issues of justice and equality, who should get what, when, and where, but also on the very question of the nature of the political. What kinds of questions should count as political questions? Imagine the political liberal saying, look, you're free to be a Marxist, or you're free to be a libertarian, but that view is for the background culture. The Marxist and the libertarian will say, well, you haven't understood my doctrine then. Marxism and libertarianism are not views that can be properly carried out as a private doctrine, right? These are public philosophies, right? And to insist that they be put in the background culture is to profoundly misunderstand them. That is part of what is at stake in our most central controversy. And this is a quote from Jim Bowman, who usually gets things just right. So that is part of what's at stake in our most central controversies. It's not just what policy we should adopt, but rather the character of public life itself, as well as the meaning and scope of our political values. Public reason cannot countenance a public deliberative space in which these fundamental issues can be reasonably engaged. It must put the values of public reason beyond public contestation. That is, public reason must generate epistemically excluded groups. Consider now the predicament of those persons that political liberalism epistemically excludes. Believing correctly that there's no point in raising their arguments in the public sphere, they will likely form small groups devoted to the advancement of their position. These groups will meet regularly to discuss the group's views and devise strategies for disseminating their message. Conditions are ripe for polarization. As the groups polarize, individuals will not only come to hold more extreme versions of their initial position, but will come to see themselves as excluded, victimized, and oppressed. Naturally, they'll also grow increasingly dismissive of opposing views, and will regard those that affirm them, the opposing views, as either evil or benighted. In this way, polarized groups are also, and I love this term from Russell Hart, epistemically crippled. That is, they grow not only do they grow increasingly extreme and increasingly convinced that they're right, but as a consequence of that, they go increasingly unable and unwilling to engage in reasoned discussion with those with whom they disagree. Fanaticism will set in. The overlapping consensus will give way to a modus vivendi, and hence precisely the kind of instability we're all sought to avoid will result. More importantly, a different kind of instability is likely to emerge, namely the kind of instability associated with hatred and violence. And Sunstein gives some evidence to suggest that this is what's operative in hate groups on the internet, for example. It may be objected that I've been merely speculating. However, if it will be granted that certain regions of our public political discourse closely approximate public reason, it can be shown that my speculations about epistemic exclusion are not implausible. My colleague in the law school at Vanderbilt, Carol Swain, has recently published an alarming study of what she calls the new white nationalist movements in contemporary America. Swain's analyses are based on interviews conducted with 10 prominent white nationalists. The transcripts of these interviews are available in a book edited by Swain and Russ Neely. Russ Neely was a white graduate student of Swain is African American, and she sent him to actually conduct the interviews. She thought it would be easier if it was a young white boy to go and do these things. An examination of the strikingly similar narratives offered by the white supremacists reveals the pattern described above. For example, and by the way, if you go look at me, it's worth looking at this book, because you get these different people, they disagree on some interesting points here and there, but they all share the same self-conception. Both William Pierce, the recently deceased founder of the neo-Nazi National Alliance, and the author of the infamous novel that inspired Timothy McVeigh to Terrorism, The Turner Diaries, and Lisa Turner, the woman's information coordinator for the white supremacist World Church of the Creator, they both claim to have been motivated by what they perceive to be a systematic refusal on the part of mainstream society to engage their ideas. It's important to note the complaint that they raise is not that people were not convinced by their positions, but rather that the public space of political reason-giving was closed to them. Hence, they characterize mainstream America not as mistaken about race, but something more. Mainstream America is brainwashed, conditioned, propagandized. Notice how epistemic these kinds of terms are, right? It's not just that you're wrong, it's that you're epistemically improper in some way if you're not a white supremacist. Hence, they claim they were forced to build their own infrastructure, and that word infrastructure comes up in all 10 of these interviews. It's really amazing. For disseminating their ideas. They both point to the internet as the most effective recruitment tool. And by the way, this is in fact true. The internet has really helped hate groups, perhaps more than purveyors of pornography. Perhaps not surprisingly, Sunstein has shown that insofar as it enables individuals to pre-select and filter the information and voices to which they will be exposed, the internet is a powerful source of polarization. Carol Swain explicitly draws the connection I've suggested between epistemic exclusion and group polarization. Quoting Swain, this is Swain talking about Sunstein's analysis of group polarization seems to describe something clearly at work among many of the white nationalist leaders that I've interviewed. I believe that one reason why many of the members and potential members of their organizations have such little exposure to the alternative viewpoints is because the overall feebleness and lack of honesty that currently dominates discussion about controversial racial issues in America. Swain, believing that America is increasingly at risk of a large-scale racial conflict, Swain makes a recommendation similar to Sunstein's. By the way, the Swain book is really, it's not a pleasant story. I mean, Swain thinks we're in big trouble. It's probably too late, she thinks, to avoid a large-scale racial conflict in America. Swain makes the recommendation similar to Sunstein's. What's most needed now is for white nationalists to be heard and debated in mainstream forums where their data and ideas can be openly evaluated and subjected to critical assessment. Despite the and by the way, Swain personally has claimed to be saying, this is what these people want. I mean, this isn't the sort of reluctance to engage on their part, or they're not willing to play by the rules. You know, they think that if given the right forum, they could convince everybody that they're right and want to do that. I mean, maybe they're self-deceived about themselves, about their motives and the quality of their commitments, but it would be good to show them that if we could. Despite the maneuvers designed to loosen the agenda and vocabulary restrictions of public reason, its non-epistemic character means that the kind of debate called for by Swain is not possible, nor are public debates concerning a wide array of other controversial moral issues. Stating Swain's and Sunstein's point more generally, Michael Sandel, observes, quoting Sandel, where political discourse lacks moral resonance, the yearning for a public life of larger meanings finds undesirable expressions. Groups like the moral majority and the Christian right seek to clothe the naked public square with narrow, intolerant moralisms, fundamentalist Russian where liberals feared to tread, end quote. To summarize, in the name of pluralism and the absolute depth of the latent conflict between citizens' comprehensive doctrines, political liberalism devises, for the sake of stability, a politics wholly lacking in political contestation. But as I hope to have shown, a politics without contestation is an epistemically unstable politics. And an epistemically unstable politics is not only politically unstable in Rawls's sense, but also dangerously volatile. And the last section here sketches what I call a view called deliberative agonism. But why don't we just end it there?
We have plenty of time for questions.
Great. Yes.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the letter from Birmingham jail because one of the things that's so great about that particular letter is the way in which it appeals to commitments that the audience already has in order to argue for a position that the audience does not yet endorse. And what's different about that and political liberalism is that it's appealing to something substantive, right? Christianity. You're not being a good Christian if you deny blacks certain rights. But so I'm having a hard time formulating a question, but it seems to me that Rawls is trying to do something similar with political liberalism, but we're taking as our givens something else. Views that, like slavery is wrong, that we arrived at by substantive means, but that we have to endorse now in a public way, apart from that justificatory heritage. What I'm wondering is whether or not you would want to preserve something about the strategy, at least in terms of persuasion. And after all, if we're going to contest the white supremacists, it seems like we would want to appeal to certain givens, like what Rawls wants to appeal to, without having to do all of the epistemic work, but at the same time not go so far as Rawls in wanting to set aside all substantive commitments. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. And let me just respond to sort of 2 points that you made. The argument about the letter from Birmingham jail, the same argument gets raised with regard to the Lincoln-Douglas debate, right? The argument is that the political liberal can't endorse Lincoln's position in that debate. Why? Because Lincoln's position appealed to substantive moral claims. The Douglas position can, appealed to the political values of, states' rights and leaving things to the people to decide and these kinds of things, right? That is that it looks like the Douglas side of that debate falls more squarely within Rawls' system than what we all think now it was the sort of right side of the debate. So there's that. You're right that maybe even just for prudential reasons, political argument can't go all the way to the sort of foundational epistemic sort of stuff, but has to sort of begin already, sort of where we are, the Bill of Rights or whatever, some set of common principles or commonly held principles. The problem, though, I guess, with the political liberal is the very view precludes or disallows or doesn't allow the political liberal to say anything as far as or to justify his choice of that set of commonly held views, right? Because clearly we could probably, this is a question for sociologists, I suppose, clearly we could find a whole bunch of other things that everyone seems to agree on, right? Which might not look so liberal after all. So there already seems to be a kind of sleight of hand in just choosing what the relevant commonly held stuff is. And perhaps you're right in another sense that, maybe it's a waste of time to go, to the white supremacist and try to argue on sort of fundamental grounds that their views are false. I happen to not think so. but maybe, politics can't wait for that debate to sort of happen, and maybe it's just that they are self-deceived about their own epistemic condition, and that they think they hold their views for good epistemic reasons, but in fact they're driven by something just like hate. I don't know. But my concern, and it's also Swain's concern, and to a different extent Sunstein's concern, is that a politics which officially eschews this kind of nuts and bolts, let's get down to what we can demonstrate to each other by means of good reasons, a politics that avoids all of that makes it very easy for the white supremacists to recruit new members. It makes it very easy for them to sound convincing to other people. Why? Because people generally are, in a sense, I don't know if there are any skeptics in the room about these things, but I'm somebody who has great philosophical faith in sort of street level epistemology. I think the guy on the street is epistemically pretty good. He thinks that he's interested in reasons and evidence and doesn't like to be deceived, and when he believes something, it's because he thinks it's true, and if he thinks it's true, it's because he thinks that he can give sufficient reasons for demonstrating it's true for these sorts of things. If you don't believe me, just turn on any of the political debate shows. I mean, it's filled with hypocrisy, but not epistemic viciousness. Everybody thinks lying is bad, there should be no spin, everything should be fair and balanced. I mean, just go look at how those slogans, which we know are just slogans, how pervasive they are. And they're pervasive because they're effective. And they're effective because at the level of what our epistemic sort of habits should be, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement, yeah. The spin zones, wherever they are, whoever's doing, spin is bad. I mean, right? Fair and balanced is the properly epistemic norm. So the worry is that in the absence, and this is again the million point, right? In the absence of a kind of robust nuts and bolts argument about these fundamental issues, the anti-liberals, the white supremacists and the racists have an easier time than they otherwise would. And in fact, what Swain argues in her book is that it's precisely because our political culture employs a set of familiar terms like inclusiveness and like pride in your heritage and like fairness and all the terms that go along with the multicultural sort of program, which I endorse. But because there's so little contestation about those views, again, the million point, it's easy to spin them. And what Swain argues is that the way that the white supremacist groups are growing and the rate at which they're growing, which is alarming, has more to do with the fact that they can very easily co-opt all of that language. And if you go and look at the sort of recruiting materials that white nationalist groups use, it's filled with appeals to pride in your heritage, open-mindedness, inclusion. I mean, it's filled with all this language, just spun and turned to a different purpose. But it's easy to do that in a political culture in which we don't regularly entertain debates of what exactly these commitments come to. And we pretend that we all agree on what they come to. And it might even be that, Rawls has this other problem. The idea that there are this set of commonly held convictions and principles that liberals tend to endorse, like slavery is bad, discrimination is unjust, and the others that he lists, might be correct if we presume kind of semantics, which tells us that there are things like principles out there. And so sort of think of if we're anti-Quinians, we can accept this view, because after all, you could talk about the principles and then say, well, yeah, people who hold different comprehensive doctrines all agree on this principle. But if we're even moderately interested or persuaded by a semantic holist kind of view, it's like, you know what? What the Thomist means by slavery, it's not so clear that's the same thing as what the Millian means or the Kantian means, or what the feminist means by discrimination, right, is in fact, in a sense, intrinsically connected, the product of that comprehensive doctrine. So the very idea that, well, we've got all these comprehensive doctrines, and look, they all can agree on that set of principles, presumes a kind of semantic picture that I don't think can be presumed. It might be true, but it can't just be presumed, I don't think. Why? Because, after all, the way the language works in political philosophy, in political philosophy, this is obvious, right? What does exploitation mean for a Nozikian? And what does exploitation mean for Adorno? So you can formulate a principle, exploitation is bad. Nozick and Adorno say yes. And then Rawls says, good, we've got an overlapping consensus on the principle exploitation. No, you don't, because the content of the principle is in part driven by the comprehensive doctrine of the person who's endorsing it. Dave?
I thought it was a great talk, and a really great time for the talk. I think about the couple other phenomena that are epistemically closed, which just, I think, besides the white nationalists. One is the homeschooling movement, which is growing, and that is happening at the early ages, so you can, close people off as epistemically early as possible. That's not the ambition, but it's to give people an environment where their comprehensive viewpoint can be explored.
Well, very often it is the ambition. Very often it's the explicit ambition of people who want to homeschool their kids to keep them away.
Right. That might not be the way they put it.
No, sometimes they do tend to put it that way. I don't want my kid being brainwashed by Satan.
Or in secularism, right? So that made me think of that. It made me also think of the national security situation. That as a reason for not disclosing daily briefings and other sorts of things. So Connie Rice, George Bush can exercise over an hour every day, but he can't make more than an hour available for the 9/11 Commission because of national security, and this is trotted out as a justification to be epistemically closed.
That's right, and Sunstein in the Why Societies Need Dissent book goes through this, not particularly with reference to the Bush administration, although I think that's part of what he's thinking, but in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, in which we now, I don't know if you've seen Fog of War. Has anybody seen the documentary Fog of War about Robert McNamara? It's worth seeing if it's playing. It's a fantastic documentary, especially if you keep in mind the Sunstein point, because what McNamara keeps alluding to, did you see? He keeps alluding to is that nobody contested the fundamental assumptions of any of the Johnson sort of expansion plans, right? Nobody, or escalation plans, nobody was allowed to disagree. And he's got these actual phone conversations where McNamara is sort of meekly saying, to President Johnson, this really doesn't seem like this probably isn't such a good idea. I don't think that this is a good plan. And Johnson, in a tone clearly indicating that he didn't want anybody to dissent, right? Well, no, this is probably what we're going to do. Now, Sunstein throughout the book shows, not only in sort of national and presidential kinds of cabinets, but just, CEOs and boards of trust meetings, groups that discourage dissent in this way perform worse, right? In their own, not in some external sort of criterion of what would count for them to be. They on their own criteria, what they're supposed to be doing, do worse than groups that maybe not even go so far as to reward, but groups that encourage a kind of devil's advocacy. And so I share your concerns on both of all three of those fronts.
Right. Well, here's a question.
Yeah.
Just a quick question then. So I'm trying to make a sort of case for Rawls through all of this, and I'm thinking, well, what is it? What are the? You've mentioned some of the points of apparent shared values that we could knock down, like slavery is too ambiguous, and some of these others.
Well, it might be.
It might be. Well, what is it that led Rawls to think that public reason wasn't sort of as thin and untenable as it sounds like it? Rawls wasn't completely deluded, right, with this idea. Well, you think he was? But anyway, well.
No, I agree with you.
Everyone leave each other alone, or don't violate the body integrity of another person against their consent. That seems to be much more, well, I don't know, you gotta think of
I mean, of course, there are all kinds of examples, I mean, especially bodily integrity. I mean, think about various kinds of arguments about the abortion debate, right? About what constitutes bodily integrity.
All right.
What constitutes interference. I mean.
But I'm just thinking, from trying to make a case for Rawls, what was he thinking that were maybe hard to contest examples of overlapping consensus that led him to believe that public reason was actually a tenable idea? Because it seems like you've knocked it down pretty quickly. So can you help me understand what led Rawls to it?
The cases, the examples that Rawls uses are the injustice of slavery, right? That slavery is unjust, and that's one that regularly returns. Another one is a sort of presumption against, liberty of conscience, right? That is, sort of a freedom of religion kind of intuition. And, I appreciate the point, right? I mean, Rawls can't be this bad. But when the tendency is to presume that Rawls had to get everything right, you have to move a little bit in the other direction. And he also talks about this sort of tradition of our own constitutional interpretation, right? So he thinks that, look, we have a constitutional tradition in this country that understands a set of, First Amendment rights and these sorts of things. And this is where we begin. If you're not on board with this, I'm not talking to you. This is a sort of Rorty kind of move, right? You want to be a Nietzschean? I just think you're crazy. You want to be some kind of radical anti-democrat? You're not going to be convinced by it. I don't have anything that's not question begging to say to you. Although Rawls doesn't exactly put it in the ways that Rorty explicitly puts it. So he thinks that the sort of constitutional stuff, which doesn't seem to be subject to this problem that I have drew on the board, because after all, we've got the decisions, we know what the reasonings were, and it's not like, well, I have a Catholic's view of what the free speech doctrine comes to, and somebody else might have, an anarchist, well, not an anarchist, sort of a Nozikian view of what the free speech doctrine comes to. It's like, well, there's pretty settled what the free speech doctrine comes to, even if we can raise these sort of questions about, fringe cases regarding file sharing and all kinds of other things like that, or, campaign finance issues. However, and
so is your contention that they just don't add up to be enough of a thing to constitute public reason, or that they're all subject to counterexamples?
Well, that's good, because I think both. Okay. One is that I think that, and this would be a different kind of argument. I think that when you get together all of the stuff that we can plausibly put in the box of the sort of uncontested, fixed beginning points that any liberal is going to be, who we're going to be able to plausibly call a liberal, is going to accept, I think that collection is too sparse to get you resolutions to the kinds of questions. It doesn't help us settle our issues. You need something more robust than just that group of things that we can that we can agree on. I think secondly, and this is one of the missions, one of the objectives of Sandel's second book, which is called Democracy's Discontent. And this isn't an objective he makes explicit, but what he's after there is to try to show that, I can go give an interpretation of our constitutional history, going as far back as Rawls wants to go, and I can show you that the principles that are driving our major court decisions are not liberal principles, but civic republican principles. Principles that invoke things about, civic virtue and presuppose some conception of the good life, these sorts of things. Now, I'm not committed or wedded to that story, but the idea that, again, there are these principles and their interpretation is sort of worn on the face, or there couldn't be any contestation about what that principle means, seems to me a kind of error I could see him making, and a kind of error the kind of error I can see people who are smart and have thought a lot about these things making, right? But we go back to Talisse in the first book of the Republic, right? harming your friends, helping your enemies. Socrates, giving back to people what you owe them, right? Socrates says, well, how do you interpret that? You might get that from a poet, but the poet doesn't tell you what it means, right? And I think that's not such a dumb mistake. I mean, it's not such an implausible error for someone smart to make, but I think ultimately that's the mistake. That there tends to be a lot more difference than Rawls is willing to acknowledge. And you might think, just one more point, right? You might think, look, Rawls, this is really peculiar because you've already told me that at the level of what you're calling moral, philosophical, and religious essentials, the conflict has absolute depth. That's his term in the preface to the paperback edition. The absolute depth of the latent conflict among these principles. So when it comes to moral, religious, and philosophical agreement, we're just not going to get it because the conflict goes too deep. Why isn't the same true of justice? And he thinks it's not. He thinks, oh, look, I can give you a view of liberal justice that I don't care who you are, Marxist, right, libertarian, Reaganite, Democrat, in the Bill Clinton sense. You're going to recognize this as your view. It's a mistake that William James makes. Pragmatism is the view that everybody's going to agree to because it gives everybody what they really want. It didn't work, did it? I know lots of people who say, I understand everything James says, and that's not the view I like. I like the tough minded view. Yes?
I just read something recently. Have you read Deborah Tannen's The Argument Culture?
Mm-mm.
No. You mentioned this viewpoint about polarization in groups that think similar, and she argues that groups where there's constant debate cause a deeper polarization than when there's efforts to not argue. That argument is counterproductive in some occasions and introductions. I haven't read the whole book.
Do you know what the argument is?
Well, she talks about the idea that there's two sides to every argument. There's two sides to every argument. We read this in class, and that she gives the example of Holocaust denial as giving equal grounds to either argument. That there's not just one side of the issue. You can't look at one thing one way. There's got to be two sides to an issue, and therefore these things have to have some forum for discussion. And that debate does not, and that the idea of the debate is more of a tends to take on more of a warlike tone as opposed to some sort of reaching a conclusion or ending, so that both sides of both arguments become more and more deeply.
I think I know the answer to your question because I read that book too, and what she argues against is the idea that formulating every contest or every political question in terms of two opposing views, and there has to be a winner, incites a certain kind of culture that doesn't help anything. But bringing various sort of objections from various sides and rolling them around and listening sort of open-mindedly and playing with the arguments so that there doesn't have to be an absolute resolution and there doesn't have to be winner or loser, because that's the real issue, isn't it?
I noticed that, but in the case of Holocaust denial, she doesn't say that. She says something different. She says they shouldn't have a platform for discussion, or for the denial of people who deny that the ozone layer is slowly coming apart. She says they shouldn't have a platform. There's no that they have to have a platform. The other side shouldn't have one either.
Right, and she uses those as examples of the firm American commitment to the claim that there are two opposing sides and there's always the coin, or there's always the toggle switch, and so the things like the Holocaust deniers should be addressed in other ways than here's the other side. We take you on as viable opponents, and we say, yes, there really was a Holocaust, and we will argue that with you so that we get down to a winner. Because what she really wants is an elaboration of sense, so that those views would be shown to be excluded from a public discourse in some other way than the warlike winner-loser, right? Because otherwise you take them on as the other side, and that's really what she's arguing against, is this two sides to every coin. Remember, that chapter's even titled that. Dave?
I was just thinking that, you know, where this connects with what you were saying, Rob, is this this notion of how to the Tannen books. It's the point about two sides is that if every inquiry is framed as an agonistic conflict, then it tends to polarize. But this issue about the Holocaust deniers connects with the thing you were saying, which is there are some people whose views are so implausible that we just don't have the time or there's no good reason to entertain those views, especially not as the other side. So it sounds like this is a question about what are the boundaries of when we say something is worth contesting about, and when and how do we draw that line?
Well, it might, okay, I understand that. It might be sort of a prudential kind of issue in that if, as is the case, Holocaust denial is a growth industry in America, oftentimes very closely connected to other kinds of political objectives that advocate violence and other sorts of perhaps even systematic violence and terrorism. I think that's one way of saying, you know, I'll give you one. The guy who believes that there was never a moon landing, who got punched in the face a year or so ago by, was it Buzz Aldrin? I mean, whoever it was. Is from Nashville, I'm very proud to say. And he has a film called Astronauts Gone Wild of him confronting the astronauts with all of this supposed evidence that there was no moon landing. You know, in a time in which we had infinite resources, you know, if we did have infinite epistemic resources, we might say, yeah, this person should be confronted. I don't know that we are morally obligated to confront this person and correct him about the moon landing, or to be corrected. I mean, you know, I don't have any arguments in favor of, you know, I haven't thought about it, to be honest with you. Maybe he's right, I don't know. But when we're talking about views, and I think Holocaust denial is a good one, that does seem to pose a certain kind of threat. I think it is worth taking them on, and if that means that we have to be agonistic or even antagonistic, okay. I mean, that might be the way to do it. I don't know that sort of peace and you know, not getting in people's faces has to trump always, especially in these cases in which this is a view which is so closely tied to, you know, acts of terrorism that we know about, right? It's sort of hard to take the live and let live view. I mean, it might not be the case. You know, I don't know that there have to be some kind of legal action or anything like this. It's just if you think you've got arguments, which they do, let's hear them. Give me the argument, you know. If not for the sake of convincing the people who hold these views that they're wrong. I mean, you might not be able to do that, but at least not making it so easy for them to win their case with new people by default because they're not contesting. Now, of course, just to pick up the earlier part, there are, I would argue, pathologies of argumentation, right? That is that, you know, the next book I'm working on is called Virtue and the Politics of Deliberation, which I think that if there is going to be a sort of call for a fully deliberative kind of politics where we are epistemically, you know, taking on all comers, at least with the stipulation that, you know, the guy who's getting punched by Buzz Aldrin might not have to be refuted, but maybe Holocaust deniers should be. There are certain kinds of vices and certain kinds of virtues that have to be sort of brought to bear on that. That is, if arguments are entered into simply for the sake of winning, then there's, I think, a very strong sense in which that's not deliberation properly. That is, deliberation is a kind of process by which you're trying to find out the truth of something, not just trying to win. So if the discussion is agonistic in a sort of strict sense, right, it's about or if it's heuristic, and it's just about winning, then I think we're failing in a certain sense. So I think that it's right to, and one who advocates a deliberative view can be fully critical of Bill O'Reilly or any of these guys, right, who are good instantiations of what I would think of as sort of a vicious sort of, an example of what vicious discussion is, because it's not properly deliberation. But again, what's so interesting, and this is, I'm still working on the first chapter of this book, but this is what the first chapter is about, is how all of these guys, whatever you think about these people, right? Limbaugh, Franken, anybody, even, I'm not talking about whether you agree with them, I'm just talking about the character in which they engage with people who disagree with them. They all promote of themselves the right view of what they're doing, right? They all profess, right? Liars and the lying liars who tell, lying is bad, truth-telling is good, treason is bad, spin is bad, right? Having your judgment beholden to special interest is bad. And all of these seem to me to be exactly proper epistemically. This is, right, they're hypocritical. They're not epistemically mistaken. They have the right epistemology. They just, it's like, to even be more charitable, they're epistemically acratic. It's a case of just weak will. They know the right thing to do and just can't do it. That might even be too charitable, right? But there are cultural questions that have to be introduced about why it is that these vicious kinds of debating sort of forums in which nobody's after truth, it's just after a soundbite that gets them the most cachet on the news, seem to be so popular. I hold out sort of as a little bit of hope that at least in their self-image, they're holding out the right epistemic view. It's just that they're hypocritical or weak-willed or something. Yeah.
Is it not fair to say that amongst liberals there is no overlapping consensus over roles in conception of public reason? And if so, doesn't that make the position self-referentially incoherent on its face?
Well, I think this is a good question in that, and I've argued elsewhere that this is exactly the case. Just think for a second. Rawls's first book, the Theory of Justice book, was, as you might, I'm sure you know, explicitly aimed, targeted against utilitarianism, right? And other things, intuitionism, whatever. But this was a full frontal attack on utilitarian conceptions of justice. In the later book, right, and this is what the two principles are supposed to be, right? These are anti-utilitarian principles of justice, right? The difference principle, right? And it's even proposed in the first book as, this is superior to any liberal conception, the difference principle, right? Economic inequalities are justifiable only insofar as they can be expected to benefit the worst off. Fair enough. We get to the second book, which has still got the same two principles. But now the idea is that everybody can jump on board, right? Now the idea is that if you're a reasonable Kantian, or if you're a reasonable libertarian, or if you're a reasonable Thomist, or if you're a reasonable utilitarian, you'll accept the difference principle too. But that's crazy. No utilitarian can accept the difference principle. There might be cases in which you will endorse the difference principle because the utilitarian calculus, right, tells him to. But as a principle of justice, no way, right? As a principle of justice, the greatest happiness principle is what justice is, right? So no utility. I think your point is exactly right. This is why. This was, in fact, the argument of the paper that people said, that was great, can you do something else? The idea was that, if the idea is that in order to get political stability, we need a conception of liberalism that, as he says, works like a module, right? It can fit in to whatever you believe. If it's sort of roughly within the sort of spectrum of liberal political theory, you're going to endorse my conception of justice because I could show you that a reasonable utilitarian is going to adopt these two principles, and a reasonable, libertarian is going to adopt them. And the way that he gets this reasonableness claim is that if you deny the fact of reasonable pluralism, you're unreasonable. That is, if you're convinced, what I call sort of an unreconstructed utilitarian, somebody who says the greatest happiness principle is true, and anybody who disagrees with it is wrong, and Kantians are Kantians are wrong, any other alternative view of justice is not as good as this one, right? Or even stronger, is false. And I've got, if you hold that view, that is, if you're a real utilitarian, you're unreasonable. And we don't have to, we can coerce you. Rawls doesn't need your consent, right, in the overlapping consensus, because you're an unreasonable. Think about also any other sort of roughly liberal, the Lockean. A real Lockean can't be a reasonable liberal on Rawls's view. Why? Because these doctrines, the utilitarian doctrine, the Lockean doctrine, a straightforward Kantian doctrine, are not themselves pluralist doctrines. They are themselves monist doctrines. They say there's but, for example, for the liberal, for the Millian or the utilitarian liberal, there's but one thing that's of intrinsic value. It's something called pleasure or satisfaction, or however sophisticated you want to get. And maximizing it, however sophisticated you want to get about what maximization is what justice is. And that's not always going to get me the difference principle. So the principle of justice is the greatest happiness principle. What I argue there is that Rawls requires the utilitarian to become what I call a reasonably reformed utilitarian. That is, the utilitarian has to say something in order to be reasonable on Rawls's view. Yeah, I think happiness is the only thing of intrinsic value, and I think that we should maximize it, and I endorse the greatest happiness principle. But hey, I understand that Kantians might be right too, and I could be wrong. And hey, I understand that, there are real hard cases that I might not be able to, that is, the Millian not only has to be kind of epistemically not hubristic and thinking that he's got all the knockdown arguments he needs, but has to hold that sort of, there are hard cases that I don't know if I can sort of respond to as a permanent condition, that there could be, in effect, no knockdown argument for an unsophisticated Benthamite version of utilitarianism. But why in the world would anybody adopt that, unless they're already committed to it, right? So it looks like the group of people to whom Rawls is appealing to get the overlapping consensus becomes very, very narrow, I think, very, very quickly. Because no straightforward, no utilitarian of the sort that we're familiar with is going to agree. Sidgwick could not agree with any of this. You're going to say Sidgwick is unreasonable? Yeah, that's what Rawls is going to say. Well, that seems to me to be crazy. And not only crazy philosophically, but to call that view pluralism is odd as well. Because what is it saying? Everybody's unreasonable except the people who agree with me.
Well, it just seems to me you're not going to get all liberals, self-described liberals, to agree with this, let alone take it to the Iraqi Governing Council and say, and give them an argument for adopting this as normative, and then moreover, what overlapping consensuses are they going to arrive at?
Well, this is right, but the international case, he's not concerned with the international case. He's got a whole separate book about the international case. So the Iraqi government is what does a liberal society say to them? But you're certainly right, and Dworkin points this out. The later Rawls can't give anybody a reason to be a liberal, not even people who are already liberals. In fact, what the later Rawls does is take away, right? If we can use this kind of language, emasculates liberalism. There's no argument for it anymore, even for liberals. And of course, even among liberals, there are going to be all kinds of debates about what their commitments really come to, policy-wise. But that's a set of debates that are almost precluded in the Rawlsian system.
At the philosophical level involving substantive principles.
That's exactly right.
Seemingly ruled out by the very procedure.
Correct. So, you're right. We agree.
Well, I see people are about to rush off to their 4 o'clock classes,
Yeah.
so can we all just thank Rob for coming and checking out?
Thanks a lot.
I was going to try to step up for Rawls.
Yeah.
He's apparently.
What?
Okay.
I didn't know he was so stupid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dave,
Just
So I don't.
yeah.
are we gonna meet?
Dubious.
Yeah.
For dinner, you just want to call me, or what do you want to do?
You're going to class.